Okay, so I don't know how many of you read the title of my talk on the brochure, but you might notice that it's different from the words that are currently on the screen. This is because when I wrote that title, I actually did intend to give that talk, but I realized it would take way longer than 10 minutes. So instead, I'm going to talk about things. As you can see, I am Aaron Jose. I am mentored by someone who shares a very similar name to me. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is how we do better evals. For those of you who actually do read my posts, you might notice that I wrote a post on this a couple of weeks ago. You start to notice a trend in this as we go on. So, how do we do better evals? What? Something to do with base models is a good answer, but it's incorrect. No. Believe it or not, I actually am going to make this serious now. Okay. So the question we should ask is, what kind of paradigm of science do we expect ourselves to be in, right? And like science is done in a bunch of different ways depending on what kind of context we're in. If you're in a very high-dimensional world where you're interacting with like really complex objects, the first problem you're going to run into is the fact is that you don't really know the right questions to be asking. This is generally, I think, the main problem we're running into with evals today. When you want to be measuring different capabilities, you're not really sure what kind of like capabilities you really want to measure. And if you're in that paradigm of science, you don't really want to end up measuring random questions that you came up with and spending a bunch of effort into rigorously measuring and controlling those particular capabilities in some context. What you really want to be doing is getting a bunch of information to ask better questions in the first place. So, to answer that question, it requires asking, are we actually in this paradigm of science? Do we actually know enough yet to be asking the right questions? So I think there are generally two levels of obfuscation to whether or not we can answer this question. The first being, what kind of things do we expect to be bottlenecks to take over, right? You might think, okay, there are things we can conjecture that are being necessary for models that are capable of doing like really competent takeover. Stuff like really superhuman levels of hacking or persuasion or phishing, things like that. And this seems like a reasonable assumption to make to me. But there's a second level of obfuscation here, which is how exactly do we expect models to do these, to perform these capabilities? That's where I think most of the ambiguity in like how we're measuring things comes in. Because if you've ever read any reports by like Meter or Apollo or other eval orgs or talk to people working at them, they always talk about here's specifically how we're measuring whether models are good at these tasks. And they're always like, are models good enough at phishing through this particular route where they set up like a fake website to scam people and like write fake emails to people and like make them fill out their credentials somewhere, when really you can just like much more trivially have models just understand someone really well enough to establish some vector of trust with them and exploit that to phish them. So yeah, I think it's generally pretty reasonable to ask which capabilities you want to measure, but like not also how you want to measure these capabilities. And that's where we really don't know like how models will end up being superhuman at them. And I'll cover a bit more of this in the next slide, but then we come on to the question of how do we ask better questions. And true, one aspect of how to do this is just not treat the model as like in a constrained interface like we do with a chat model. And I think, Theo's experiments on this are like somewhat related, but he was testing out how good a model is at playing chess. And when he compared GPT 3.5, the base model, and the chat model, even the fine-tuned chat model doesn't come close to like the capabilities exhibited by the base model, even with like a prompt that didn't have a ton of effort put into it. So if you're measuring capabilities in a very constrained interface, you're implicitly going to be setting a lower bound on how good your model can be at something. So if you want to like identify how good your model can possibly be at something, or at least come close to it, especially if you want to forecast future capabilities, you probably want to be doing like much more open-ended reasoning, getting just a bunch of information to ask better questions. And yeah, that's my reason how you do better evals. And the next one, thoughts on AI control. So first question, which ties into the previous thing, how good do we need our capability evals to be? In the field of control especially, where you really want to have benchmarks in place for how much you can control your next generation of models, this is the one place where we need our capability evals not to be indexed too hard on the models in front of us. Like it's entirely fine to say, yeah, GPT-4 just is this good. No one has access to the base model, so no one has access to like really competent scaffolding, so it's fine if we just go ahead and like do these evals and say this is how good our model is. But very often you'll find that the things that end up being like really fuzzily and really difficult to access capabilities in current generation of models are usually the things that end up being really salient in the next generation of models. For those of you who've read like any of Janus's writing, this is like pretty salient in a bunch of them. For those of you who haven't, You might be interested in reading Janice's comment to reply to Beth Barnes on my post, where she feeds in Beth Barnes' reply into GPT-4, and GPT-4 guesses that it is Beth Barnes, and GPT 3.5 just cannot do this at all. And yeah, so if you want forecast future models capabilities, you probably want we are asking really, really competent questions here. But the second question is, if you want to do good AI control, wait, I should probably caveat here. All of you here know what AI control is, right? And let's talk about what I'm referring to here. Okay, good. So another crux here as far as doing good AI control here is, how early do we expect superhuman performance in a bunch of takeover relevant domains before transformative AI? And when I say takeover relevant domains, I generally mean superhuman hacking skills, superhuman persuasion skills, and stuff in that vein. And I don't know about hacking, but when I think about persuasion, I think that models are probably on the margin of superhuman right now, and I expect that they'll be very, very easily superhuman at this before transformative AI. In fact, this seems really, really overdetermined to me, just for the sheer capacity of how much they understand the author of some text. There's a bunch of evals that people are running on this. Eggstock was related to this. Yeah, Eggstock was related to this. If you try this out with the current model, it understands what a person's personality traits are, what their quirks are extremely, extremely well. And I expect that this will only get better over time. And if you expect that understanding a person really, really well is really useful to being really good at persuading them to do things, then I expect superhuman persuasion to be pretty trivial. And okay, looking at the time, I'm guessing I'm not trying to get into this because this is by far the weirdest of all of these points. So I'm just going to skip over this and ask this question. What kind of explanations do we want from interpretability? That's a good question. I'm going to leave that out to the Q&A if anyone wants to ask me questions on that. Anyway, future work. As you can see here, the things I want to do are building a better framework for interpretability, by which I mean, generally asking the question of what kind of explanations do we want of interpretability, and what kind of work do I actually expect to get us there. If any of you are familiar with my work on high-level interpretability, this is pretty much that. More work on objective detection specifically, and gradient descent on the human brain, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. And questions? Joseph. Good question. I think the very, very high level question, which I'm hoping you won't ask me much more about because there are people who want to ask more questions, is that in general there are certain things we want out of an AI system for us to be reassured of its safety. And the things we really want out of any kind of interpretability work at all is something that answers those questions very directly. So less ontology identification in the sense of understanding what the fundamental units of a model are, and more here are the things we care about, what are their equivalents in the model's ontology, stuff like that.
Doesn't this kind of conflict with the thing you were saying earlier about us correctly not being able to ask the right questions?
Yes, it does. I'm kidding. No, I don't. I tend to think that, to be clear, I generally think that most current mechanistic interpretability is still really, really good. It is buying us a bunch of bits. But I think with when I think of what kind of explanations we want out of interpretability, I think there are some pretty relevant questions we can ask right now, just in terms of most of my work goes into, well, objective detection stuff. And I think when you're trying to do objective detection stuff, that's a question you can try to start answering right now, just in terms of how do you robustly steer a model by interfacing with this internal mechanistic objective. I think that a bunch more information will be really useful there, but there's definitely some practical progress we can make right now. Does that make sense?
What do you mean by explanation?
What do I mean by explanation? I don't know, just generally, can you understand why a model is doing what it's doing?
What is on your wish list for top interpretability asks this year? Get a dashboard summarizing information about internal frontiers for models. What would be on a dashboard?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, what's your wish list, interpretability wish list?
I don't know. I mean, if I'm being really ambitious, I'd probably just say something that actually does allow us to robustly steer models. I'm guessing you want something more fine-grained than that. I mean, I think if you have that, that'll be just the one thing on my wish list. Then yeah, that just solves interpretability as far as I'm concerned. But I don't know, something that a really, really good benchmark for interpretability as far as more low-level interpretability goes would also be really, really solid. I think low-level interpretability is still really useful, but that it's really hard to measure whether we've understood enough of our models. Something that allows us to benchmark robustly, whether or not we've understood enough of our models would be really solid as well, I think. So.
Can you give some concrete examples of what you want to do is really work to move in this direction?
In the interpretability direction?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if you've read my post from last year. I'm guessing no, because none of you ever read less wrong posts. But yeah, I mean, Right now, I'm like running a couple of projects. So I'm probably guessing the main one in that vein is just like, here are some properties about objectives. Can you like train, I don't know, probes to extract activation structures that broadly have these properties and then see how much steerability you get out of them? The experiment I ran last year was in this vein. You get like a non-trivial amount of predictive power and like steerability out of them. I'm doing some work to extend that in a bunch of directions. I'm also doing some work with my Mars team. Someone from my Mars team is here. You can ask him about that if you're interested. I'm running a couple of other projects. Like if you're familiar with Adria's work, it's also in a similar vein where he's also like trying to come with some properties to like extract to understand optimization happening inside models better and being like, okay, cool. And what do we do with these things and so on and so on. Yeah, Abe, you have questions, but the time is out, so you can ask me after this.